All right. Thank you, Dr. Berzin and Dr. Sawhney, for two terrific talks. I'm joined right now by Dr. Berzin. Dr. Sawhney should be joining shortly. We're a little ahead of schedule, but we'll just go ahead and get started with some of the questions that have come in. So, Dr. Berzin, one of the first questions here was about jumping from the colon to the stomach and how you may approach uh, removing multiple gastric polyps? And do you use cold snares primarily for gastric as well as duodenal polyps?
Yeah, yeah. So the gastric polyp, there's a range of gastric polyps we might be removing. The most common we encounter are either fundus gland polyps or hyperplastic polyps. Fundus gland polyps probably don't need to be removed. Those are the PPI-induced polyps that are proximal, but they can look similar to hyperplastic polyps. So we usually, to start off with, at least biopsy to know what you're dealing with. Hyperplastic polyps that are greater than a centimeter should be removed. There is a precancerous potential. I typically do use cautery for those because they are so oozy, and they often bleed even with cautery, and you still often need to place a clip. But cold snare often makes a mess of the hyperplastic polyps. So I usually use cautery for those.
Okay. And any comment about duodenal polyps?
Oh yeah, so for duodenal polyps, now we're talking more usually flat adenomas that we're running into, and those I do routinely cold snare. I think a cold snare technique is in the duodenum is one of the best applications of cold snare technique. So regardless of the size of duodenal polyps, I try to use cold snare when I can.
Okay, great. And so there's a question here about when you talk about using saline immersion. So do you have a preferred way of introducing water or saline for immersion, and you just use the water jet?
Just the water jet. Yep, that is enough to there are more advanced tools you can get for super high volume water immersion, but just the water jet is fine.
And do you try to take air out at the same time or not?
Yeah, in order for water immersion to, it depends a little bit on where gravity sits. If the polyp is already under a gravity dependent area, sometimes you don't need to do much with air, and a little bit of water takes care of it. But if it is a non-gravity dependent area, usually you have to take out the air.
Okay, great. And so this is a question about polyp with central depression or ulceration. If it's about a centimeter or so, is it ever worth trying to remove endoscopically if you suspect that there may be malignancy there?
So, we can run into malignancy regardless of polyp size. Even a 1 centimeter polyp, if it's ulcerated or looks malignant, may very well be malignant. And so I would trust your intuition and your analysis of the appearance of the polyp. It does not have to be big to be a malignancy. And if it's ulcerated or depressed, it's going to be difficult, possibly unsafe to remove, let alone the fact that it probably harbors malignancy. So those polyps, I'll usually start off with just biopsying and tattooing. I won't usually generally try to take those off.
Okay, great. So there are a couple questions. I think they're sort of around the same issue of like trying to remove like a sessile polyp with a cold snare and it doesn't go through and it doesn't
Mm.
cut.
Oh yeah.
Is it okay to just keep tugging or pulling or what do you do?
Yeah, so this is a frustrating thing that I think we all encounter if we take either a little bit too much tissue, either because it's too much wide tissue or because we've suctioned a little bit and a little bit too much submucosa comes in. As long as you don't think you have a lot of the colon wall on there and you're really convinced you have just good grip of the polyp and a little bit of submucosal tissue, it is fine to pull. There's a term for this, and it's called cold snare avulsion. And actually, Dr. Sawhney, who you just saw before, did a study on this showing that generally you're just getting submucosal tissue, you're not getting muscle. You can't really easily pull through muscle. So that cold snare avulsion technique is safe to use. You shouldn't be using it every day or every week, but on the occasion that it happens, if you're otherwise really happy with the appearance of where your snare is, it's okay to do.
Okay, great. This is just a follow-up, I guess, on the whole water immersion technique. And are there areas of the colon that it's just not possible to achieve that?
It really has more to do with gravity than anything else. And so if I can get the spot under gravity, then generally I can get it underwater. One thing I didn't really go over in the talk is that I often use some of these techniques in together. And so there are times where I might get 2/3 of a polyp off with hot snare, and then the last third of it is just driving me crazy, and it's not lifting very well, or some other problem is happening. And then I'll just try immersing that and do a focused immersion, maybe with a thin cold snare, because the cold snares sometimes have a better grip at the edge of just barely elevated polyp tissue. So sometimes using these techniques together can be helpful.
Okay, so when you say like try getting the patient in the right position, does that mean maybe like repositioning the patient
Sometimes
too?
repositioning them. If I'm convinced that water immersion is the only way to do it, and I can't get it underwater, usually moving the patient will do it.
Okay, great. Um, Question here about, are there situations when you try to use a clear cap at the end to help with the polypectomy?
Yeah, so there are some folks that are really passionate about using caps for all advanced resection, or even honestly just for colonic inspection. A cap is one of the distal attachment devices you can use just to improve colon inspection. This is a purely subjective thing. I don't tend to like to use caps unless I'm really struggling with a polyp that's behind a fold, or I need to sort of depress tissue in certain ways. So I'm comfortable doing most of our advanced resection work without a cap. ESD is a different category. Dissecting in an ESD, a cap can be useful, but for routine large EMRs, I personally don't use a cap most of the time.
Okay. Now this I don't know if it may be a long question for you to answer, but are there specific types of snares in terms of size and type that you should recommend as an absolute minimum that you should have available in the endoscopy unit?
So I really actually like this question because there are many companies selling 1,000 different varieties of snares, and I actually think that represents some risk for running a high quality endoscopy unit. I think in a lot of ways it makes sense to have a workhorse snare that is used for almost everything. So a couple of workhorse snares that we typically will use is a thin wire cold snare, and then a 15 mm hot snare. Between those two snares, generally speaking, you can do about 98% of what you need to do. And I don't think operationally, efficiency wise, for cost, for a variety of other things, it makes sense to have 35 different snares that each different physician prefers. I think it's harder for nurses to find, harder for physicians to choose. So I think we can miss the forest for the trees, and I think it is often better to be simple, and a good 15 mm hot snare and a 10 mm cold snare will get you by 98% of the time.
Okay, great. So there's a question here for Dr. Sawhney, but I think you can probably answer this as well. This is related to using AI and CADI for polyp detection. And I guess the question is, what is any thoughts about where we're going with that, whether that should be
Yeah.
standard? I don't think it's a formal recommendation yet, but what are your thoughts about where and what we should be
Yeah.
doing with that?
So I don't think it is considered standard of care. What is standard of care is that all of us should be making steps towards improving the quality of our procedures. And one of the ways to demonstrate quality is to use enhancement tools, whether it's a distal attachment cap or AI, or measure your own adenoma detection rates. All of those things are manifestations of quality. And I think that as a general direction, those are all things we should be doing. We're not at a point where our societies are saying you have to use a distal attachment cap or you have to use AI. And reality is all of these steps are making somewhat incremental improvements. They probably improve things for some gastroenterologists more than others, but we're not at a point where we have to say that these have to be in routine use. I'll comment on the AI piece because I've done a lot of the work on polyp detection. Polyp detection was sort of the low-hanging fruit for AI tools, but it really, I think of it as an incremental application for a revolutionary technology. Polyp detection is just the tiniest little first step of AI and endoscopy, and it's not actually in and of itself a world changer. It helps us detect polyps a little bit more.
All right, great. Thank you. Dr. Sawhney, thank you for joining us. I will maybe just ask you that first same question that we posed to Dr. Berzin. There are questions related to AI in colonoscopy, and maybe more specifically about using it for, polyp detection. And what are your thoughts there?
So I think we have randomized data showing that AI improves polyp detection. I think the thing to keep in mind is that relatively small increases in adenoma detection rate translate into clinical meaningful outcomes. like decrease in the risk of developing colon cancer and decrease in the risk of dying from colon cancer. So I think any small incremental increase in ADR is acceptable. I mean, is welcome. I think we also have studies showing that when you combine different technologies, like when you combine AI and endocuff, which is a cap on the end of a scope, you increase polyp detection even further. And then when you combine it with looking at the right colon twice, you get an even further incremental increase in ADR. So I think those are all steps in the right direction.
Okay, great. So there's a question here about, is there an ideal polyp detection rate as opposed to adenoma detection rate?
Yeah. So as you know, there's been a slight move towards looking at different quality indicators. The advantage of the polyp detection rate over the adenoma detection rate is that you don't need to have pathology to compute a polyp detection rate. You can simply use your billing records. So the numerator would be the colonoscopies that were built as colonoscopy with polypectomy, and the denominator would be all colonoscopies that you did. And then, very quickly you can calculate your polyp detection rate. The reason why people had not used polyp detection rate previously was because it hadn't been validated. We didn't have any studies showing that an increase in polyp detection rate corresponds to a meaningful decrease in the risk of interval colon cancer or dying from colon cancer. But the New Hampshire Colon Cancer Registry and then the Polish group published studies last year that have validated both the polyp detection rate and this other measure called the adenoma per colonoscopy. So you calculate the total number of adenomas you detected, you divide it by the total number of colonoscopies. So that's the other quality indicator. And now both of them are validated quality indicators. So I think moving forward, depending on what works in your workflow in your lab, you can either compute an adenoma detection rate, you could compute a polyp detection rate, or you could compute a adenoma per colonoscopy quality indicator, and all three are now validated measures of quality of colonoscopy.
Okay, great. And so kind of just following up on that theme, is there any role for detecting a serrated polyp detection rate? And is that something that's included in ADR or not?
So currently we don't include serrated polyps in ADR just because there's so much variability in how pathologists report serrated lesions. So currently we're only including adenomas in the calculation for adenoma detection rate. There is an additional measure, as you're alluding to, as the serrated polyp detection rate. That's another quality indicator for colonoscopy. It's not validated. I think we should stick with the three validated colonoscopy quality indicators and probably choose one of those. And then obviously, if someone's doing research or you have a particular focus, you can use other quality indicators. But I think, we have three good validated measures, and I think we should choose from one of those three.
So just as a final sort of, any suggestions or tips, I guess, for many practices, calculating those numbers can be a manual, difficult process. And I wonder whether there are any suggestions or products, or this is probably a good AI project, but are there things that you're aware of that could help individuals or practices kind of calculate those numbers on a more automated basis?
Tyler, you want to start with what AI can do for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that as long as the medical record systems are increasingly integrated, now more and more of us are using endoscopy reporting softwares that integrate with our central EHR chart or with our pathology. The math of an ADR is not that complicated, but selecting which patients should be considered in the calculation is a little bit harder. And a variety of companies are using natural language processing to try to get this data sort of more and more precise. And my big point is I think we have to demand that as physicians. In order for us to improve, we need to be able to measure quality easily. And I think we all acknowledge that we cannot measure quality easily. It's a lot of incredible effort right now, Excel sheets, back of the envelope stuff, handwriting. that's not the way we should be doing it. And so, so I try to be as loud and obnoxious as I can with EHR companies to say this is a critical need for this to be a button click, point click, just get it done. And we're just not there yet. I think there's a huge gap between where we are and where we need to be.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think the lowest hanging fruit is the polyp detection rate, because you can calculate that from your administrative database. So that should be something that you can automatically generate on a monthly basis, and then have some kind of a threshold. And if someone dips below that threshold, then you can look deeper by calculating the ADR or adenoma per colonoscopy, or even withdrawal time, which is a little harder to calculate. But I think that should be the algorithm one should follow.
But there's a future state, which I think is not that long away, a few years, where we'll be able to use generative tools to ask questions like, what's the percentage of polyps under 5 millimeters in size that were removed by cold snare from October 10th to September 30th? And the data will pop up in front of us, because it's actually a simple question. It's simple math. It's just the link between gathering all the data and analyzing it is what the EHR companies are not offering. But I think that is actually going to be doable. I think it's going to be a sea change for us in gastroenterology when we can just ask those questions and get an answer right away.
All right, great. There's a final just question or maybe comment on like why reimbursement is not proportional to the number of polyps removed from 1 to 20. I don't know if anyone here can answer that. Certainly, yeah, I think that you could certainly use a modifier code to indicate the number. A longer procedure based on number of polyps, but yeah, I think that that's something that
I think my only general comment on that is that when we have these little spaces where we feel like reimbursement is not fair for a particular procedure, one of the fears of the GI societies is when you open up a reimbursement discussion, all of a sudden everything else is on the table as well. And so there's a risk and a concern that the changes might be zero sum or worse than zero sum, even if we make some incremental improvements about, to say, polyp number.
Okay, great. There is a comment here that Dr. Berzin's talk is not in the syllabus. We will make sure those slides get in there. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but we'll get that in today. All right, so I want to thank Dr. Berzin, Dr. Sawhney for a really outstanding session. We will take a break right now, and then we will come back at 10:15, okay, for additional more endoscopy-related topics, okay? Thank you.